we first of all need to explain to you that there's a particular variant of the ITC label which we have adopted, known as ITEC, and this is Information Technology, Electronics and Computing. We've adopted it not for any good, how shall I say, intellectual reasons. Simply, we've adopted it because it was the term that was used in a project which we were commissioned to do, and so we went with it, basically. So ITEC, for what it's worth. I just want to make some basic contextual points about our work. A very obvious point to people here that the criticality of ITEC as a sector to global business, to global capitalism, that we talk about ITEC as a kind of driver and enabler of organizational change, which is I'm sure, an obvious point to you. But I think also it's helpful to think of a distinction between users and developers in this context. And it may be a distinction that's useful for other people as well when we're grappling, as we did in our group, with what exactly we mean by this sector. In terms of users, what we're talking about is IT being used to enable various aspects of the organization. So HRM could not focus without IT systems. Finance could not operate. So it basically underpins all organizations, but in a user capacity. And then you've also got the developer capacity, or the developer function, if you like. And we can think there of major multinationals, household names. And there, of course, ITEC is a major driver of the economy. So we can't get away from the fact that, and we wouldn't want to, that this is an extremely important sector that we're talking about, even if we have difficulty in defining it. Now, in terms of gender, you'll be aware of the concept of the war for talent, which comes from the States. The view being that business needs diversity. In order to be effective, in order for productivity to be maximized, you need diversity. And diversity is typically seen as in terms of gender. So women seen as a key resource, bringing new skills and ideas. It's not always seen in that light. It's, for example, seen in terms of ethnicity sometimes, but typically it's about having more women involved. Now, I don't need to say very much about the representation of women in computing, because we've all grasped that it's low, and in many countries it is actually decreasing. So there's some example there of some calculations that we did using the government standard industrial classification, where you can see that if you take the computing and related classification, you see women are clearly in the minority, and it's falling. So this is really a very interesting case where, if you look at other areas of science, engineering, technology, it's either bumping along in stability, or it's increasing, and in some cases increasing quite markedly. For example, chemistry increasing quite markedly. But IT appears to be this outlier here. So a very interesting case. Now, well, I need also to say that as well as an overall figure of representation, that we have evidence of what we would see as traditional gender segregation, so of vertical segregation and of horizontal segregation. The higher up you go in the professional occupations, the lower the representation of women. So, for example, software engineers in the UK, 14%. That gives you a picture. So the higher up, in the more skilled jobs, the lower the representation of women. We're also, and Christina is going to refer to this, have evidence of women leaving, or some evidence, and it's perhaps a bit sparse, of women leaving ITEC in mid-career. So that's an important aspect to consider. What is it about the mid-career point that is perhaps a risk point? And, as you pointed out to me, Joanne, that, how do we know that actually ITEC is any different from any other occupation? So that's an important point. And The last point that I want to make there on that slide is that some authors have argued that we've had thousands of initiatives. Thousands. Domsch, for example, says that in Europe alone there have been several thousands. I do think we need to pay attention to this and to the point that was made this morning, which of course draws attention to the lack of evaluation, generally speaking, that if evaluation is carried out, then it's on a very short-term basis, and it's long-term evaluation that we need. Just to introduce what Christina is going to be talking about, this is a presentation that draws on a couple of studies that were funded by the European Social Fund, and the lead partner was an organisation called ITEC. It was also supported by the British government of the time. It was what we would term dual-purpose research. It was commissioned commercial research, but we also managed to get some academic publications out of it, which have been published in Work, Employment and Society, and hopefully soon in Gender, Work and Organisation, which are kind of key sociological journals, both with a national and international reputation. So we have, if you like, capitalized on being commissioned to do this work, but also managed to get some more academic, some more theoretical stuff out of it. But we're really going to be reporting on something that's sort of in between those two areas today, so a kind of descriptive aspect, but also our analysis, if you like, of the issues that were raised. What we did was to carry out interviews with 28 HR, human resource, and hiring managers in 20 organizations, mainly private sector, a few public sector, and these were major household names, so the IBMs, Googles, Microsoft, Unilever, and so on. We're very lucky to get access to these organizations via the lead partner, ITEC. We can't claim that we managed to do that ourselves. It's notoriously difficult, of course, to get access to these organizations. They were chosen because they wanted to recruit more women. And so they kind of volunteered themselves saying, hey, this is what we're doing. And so the aim of the project was to get their views, their voice on how to recruit more women. And so what you get from that is, in fact, their voice. And we report, first of all, on their voice, what they thought was important, what they thought was working, with very little evaluation, I would say, but essentially their voice. And then Christina will, having described that, Christina will move on to some more analytical points, and I'll just come back at the end.
Okay, thank you, Judith. So I'm just going to start with saying a little bit around the key findings here, and you'll notice we've used the phrase best practice, which maybe isn't such a good phrase, but we've used it because it's the practices that organisations told us worked in their organisations, but with a caveat that possibly we come back to around the evaluation. So having recognised difficulties in potentially women want to join some of these ITEC companies, organisations had focused on really practices which were called widening the recruitment net. So looking at the way in which they position themselves at recruitment fairs, looking at the way in which they position themselves in the recruitment literature, even to the extent to which they position themselves and make these ITEC occupations attractive, in inverted commas, to women themselves. So those were the sorts of things that they were doing, and they were very much looking at what approach had they taken in the past, were women represented in some of these recruitment practices, or had it been typically been a male activity. So really trying to think of some of those aspects to the recruitment process. Managing organisational reputation was something that they said was really important, and indeed our specialist recruitment agencies said that was something that was quite important too, in the sense that women, when they were looking for employment, and we have to have the caveat here that we were interviewing the managers and the HR managers. We didn't get the opportunity to interview the people who had been recruited, and that's possibly, you might suggest, is a flaw in our research, and we'll come back to that later. But the notion of reputation, does this organisation have a reputation for recruiting women? Does it have a reputation for developing women? Does it have programmes that might lead to accredited qualifications from which women would then actually want to select themselves into those organisations? And then part of that then was rethinking what are the essential criteria for this job? And part of that is what's the degree that somebody needs to have to come into this particular organisation? And there was a sense from some that the types of jobs that were on offer, and one of those was very much the project management role, that do you need an IT degree? Do you need to be a computer scientist? And some were positioning themselves more to the arts and the humanities. And that's what they were majoring on in terms of their recruitment campaign. But behind that was getting managers to rethink what was required in a particular job at a particular time. And I think that was quite an important point, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. We did get examples of this use of the competencies, particularly the behavioural characteristics, which we've talked about already over the last couple of days, how important it is having this range of soft skills. And these were quite diverse in some respects, but it was felt that being able to plan our recruitment around that and to be able to signpost that that's what we're looking for could potentially make, and I keep using the word could potentially make these jobs more attractive to women. So some of the things that we've already talked about in terms of communication, relationship building, particularly around the ability to be able to network, etc., was deemed to be quite important as part of that process. But again, the next point was, I think, none of these changes could happen in isolation. No individual member in HR, no individual HR policy was going to work. So it was important to engage with a number of what we call different stakeholders here. And the role of the specialist recruitment agencies. So these were recruitment agencies who were focusing particularly on the ITEC sector, who had a lot of knowledge around the jobs that were on offer, what it is that organisations said that they wanted, and also working with those recruitment agencies to communicate what the diversity policies were of these organisations, what they were hoping to achieve was quite important. And then the role of working in partnership with line manager, and this is, I think, particularly in the area of human resource management, is particularly important, is what is their responsibility for the development of people, and how does the specialist HR unit work in partnership with the sort of HR community themselves. So a number of different strategies there in terms of really trying to widen the recruitment net itself. But I think the thing that we did, we were asked to look at recruitment practices, we were asked to look at the ways in which organisations were trying to develop that. But what we can't do is actually look at recruitment in isolation from retention, because the strategies for retention can influence recruitment. So I think we had examples in the interviews. It's very difficult to keep people to the question when you ask in interviews. But we had examples of we need to think about not only getting women into our organisation, but what's going to encourage them to actually stay. And you can see that we've uncovered a number of practices, probably many of them we've already covered already. Flexible working has been used very much in the literature as a key lever to encourage more women to join organisations. It's deemed as that's going to make it a potentially more family-orientated environment, etc. The notion of women-only development programmes, however you label that, in terms of mentoring, specific leadership development programmes for women only. the degree to which we're setting up women's networking groups within the organisation, but also connecting women to networking groups outside, and even to the extent of specialist women recruitment agencies too that might have able to provide some information. The other area which is really important, and this came across possibly particularly more so in our public sector organisations, is this commitment to internal recruitment. So looking for opportunities for women who have possibly worked in one role. And just to give an example that then of women who, and this takes us into the use of the soft skills, is women who've actually possibly worked in this customer facing, maybe customer service, encouraging them to move into the help desk arenas where they're going to be dealing with communications problems as well. So we need to, those are some of the things that we uncovered here as well. And I'll just say one point before I move on to some of the critical pieces then, which is around the encouraging the difference between organisational returners. This is women who've actually taken a period of maternity leave, and a distinction that we found, which is around occupational. This is women who've taken a career break, but actually would like to maybe re-enter either to the same profession, but not necessarily the same occupation, or want to use that as an opportunity to re-engage with a different profession. So that's what organisations told us. And then, as Judith said, as we've started to rework or reflect on, I think, probably the data in a little bit more, we've started to look at, well, this emphasis on soft skills. How does this affect some of the longer-term career opportunities? We have raised questions around the implications for the gender pay gap. Is it going to channel women into particular roles which restrict their opportunities? We have this rhetoric, the talk of the soft skills, how important it is. But we heard from the recruiters that actually, in the face of pressure to recruit somebody, that sometimes those softer skills aren't necessarily showcased, or they not necessarily prepared to take the risk of showcasing those at a particular time with a particular client. Flexible working, whilst we've said that organisations view this as being important, what we found is more evidence of flexible working being in terms of the examples of different forms of flexible working, which might be part-term, it might be starting early, finishing late, it might be called what some refer to as the mommy track, which is you can start work, go pick the children up and carry on working till midnight if that suits your work-life balance. Or not. But what we actually found was examples, and this comes back to possibly the behaviour of line managers, of you had to have a reputation of delivering first, possibly before you were allowed access. So you had to be somebody who was known to deliver. And until you've established yourself, how do you develop that reputation with something? And equity issues too, something that we needed to consider. And I think we'll come back to the point about the issues around monitoring and measurement of, these were initiatives that had been started, maybe different parts of the business had started various things, but what's the connection? I mean, the culture, organisational culture, and I think we spoke about this in terms of the educational culture, so I'll just pick up on a few things. But some recent, an article that we've recently identified, which is some work by Guzman, which we can actually now connect with some of the work that we, in terms of the work we did with organisations, is this high value. So why is women in ITEC any different? It's the high value that's placed on technical knowledge. So despite the fact that soft behavioural characteristics, the technical is still very important in certain roles. And then we've got this, linked with that then is this re-education. And who's paying for that re-education? Is it the employer? Is it in your own time? Aspects of the work itself, the rules. I think possibly taking an HR perspective, that sometimes the ITEC are actually deemed as being slightly deviant. And then the cultural forms, the language, the jargon, etc. So I think just to sort of, what we're suggesting then is this cultural aspect is something which is we identified as being problematic. There's still more work that needs to be done to unpack that. And it's potentially that cultural aspect, which has resonated so much with the things we've heard so far, I think, in terms of the culture in the educational system that we need to consider. So Judith's going to just say a few concluding points here.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think just a couple of points that I would like to make at the end, that we conducted this research before the economic decline, and I think then we might want to consider whether some of the arguments which the organisations made to us, which were around corporate responsibility and around social justice, as well as bottom line arguments, whether those social justice arguments carry very much weight in a context of economic decline. And there's quite a large literature on the notion that if long-term change is to happen, then organisations need to be committed both to a social justice agenda and also to their bottom line. And if it's only bottom line arguments to say that diversity will help productivity in whatever way, if that's not underpinned by social justice, then these changes are likely to be rather fragile, if at all, or short term, if you like. So there's that point then about economic decline and a changing picture. I would also make the points that, as I indicated at the beginning, that evaluation does seem to be extremely important. These organisations were clear in their minds that initiatives X, Y, and Z worked, but they had very little evidence. And one of the reasons that they had very little evidence was because they need better data, they need better baseline data, and they need to have a commitment to long-term evaluation. And so, again, because of economic decline, those things seem likely to be undermined. We've put up there some research areas that we're developing which followed on from the research that we've just described. I won't say anything about those. There's something which you, if you want to bring up in questions, feel free to, because we've run out of time. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you for listening.